The resignation of Ambassador Carlos Pascual generated a debate on how frank diplomats can be about their host country's problems without irritating sensitivities in times where WikiLeaks revelations can put at risk the relations between countries. Today we welcome Ana María Salazar, Executive Director, Mexico Weekly Magazine. Thank you very much, Ana María. Pleasure, as usual, having you in Uno Noticias.
Oh, it's great to be back, Gaby.
Well, I would like to know, in your opinion, what is the origin of this conflict? WikiLeaks or the relationship with Presidente Calderón?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, clearly WikiLeaks exacerbated the irritation that President Felipe Calderón has with the United States. And the fact that it was made public, opinions that people within the U.S. Embassy, including Ambassador Carlos Pascual, have in terms of, PAN politicians, the role of the armed forces, the effectiveness of the armed forces, the effectiveness of the president's strategy. The fact that it comes from the U.S. government irritated him, I believe, in terribly. The truth is, many of those comments already had been made by media. In fact, I have written columns about some of these issues. So it has to do with WikiLeaks and already a situation which had been deteriorating, in part because of the inability of both countries to figure out a way, for example, to stop the flow of illegal arms into Mexico, and the difficulties Mexico is having, for example, controlling violence in the northern border.
But it is also true that as a result of WikiLeaks, many other countries read things they wouldn't have otherwise seen, but this didn't damage the relationship between them. Can't diplomats just express their opinions openly?
Well, they can express it openly if it's within documents that is only going to be read by their own countries. I mean, I think part of the problem, and this is one of the roles diplomats have to play, generally speaking, is that when they express opinion about the countries in which they're serving, they have to be very careful, because particularly if they're representing the U.S. government. And in this case, and we have to remind your audience, it's not that Carlos Pascual said it publicly, and there has been cases where U.S. ambassadors have been very public about their opinions. That did not happen here. This was published illegally, and it was comments and opinions that were never supposed to be made public. So diplomats, I think, what is the role of a diplomat? A diplomat has to be kind of a go-between, a mediator between their country, the United States, in this case it would be the United States, and the country in which they're serving. And when you publicly express, or your opinions are publicly are made public or filtered to the media, then that is definitely going to create problems.
Carlos Pascual is described by detractors and supporters as a sincere, cerebral, and activist diplomat who speaks his mind. How reasonable is Mexico's objections to his performance?
You know what's so ironic about this? When you look at other ambassadors that have served in Mexico, U.S. ambassadors that have served in Mexico, Carlos Pascual was actually a good ambassador. He, in terms of trying to figure out ways to mediate the differences between both countries. And it's not an easy moment to be an ambassador, U.S. ambassador in Mexico, in the same way it's not an easy moment to be a Mexican ambassador in the United States. There's a lot of differences, there's a lot of tensions in the bilateral relationship. And I think Carlos Pascual was actually doing a good job in terms of trying to be firm in terms of what is the United States' position publicly, but at the same time doing it in a way that it wasn't antagonistic to the Mexican government. Where he got into trouble was when all these documents were leaked. So it's probably, I don't think Mexico's going to get a much better U.S. ambassador than what they had in Carlos Pascual.
Who might replace him, and will Pascual remain in Mexico until his successor is approved?
I'm not clear, but clearly he is going to stay in Mexico for a while more, even though he's tendered his resignation. And there's a lot of speculation as who could potentially replace him. The truth of the matter is that the process in which Carlos Pascual replacement is selected, it's going to be long, it's arduous. The candidate, be either he or she, is going to have to go before a committee in the Senate, and in order to be approved by the Senate. I mean, it's not that, you know, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton just decide an ambassador. They got to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And probably what's going to happen is during the confirmation process and the confirmation hearings, there's going to be a lot of questions asked about Mexico, about the bilateral relationship. Is the money that the United States providing to Mexico the adequate amount? Is it being used appropriately? And that process in itself, unfortunately, I believe, is going to create more tensions.
I was going right there to the long-term relationship. What might the impact be on this relationship?
Well, in the long term, maybe it's not going to have any visible or measurable impact. Because fortunately, between both countries, they've developed mechanisms by which they can communicate even when there's tensions in the relationship. And this in part has to do with NAFTA. One of the important things about NAFTA that I think everybody forgets is that it creates mechanisms to solve conflicts. But also throughout the years, both countries, particularly in the area of the war against drugs and organized crime, they've found mechanisms by which they can share information, talk to each other, and the relationship can continue more on the operational levels, even though there could be tensions both in Washington and in Mexico City. Now, in the short term, we really have to hope that nothing catastrophic happens in Mexico or nothing terrible happens, because when an ambassador becomes extremely important for a bilateral relationship is when there's an emergency and when there has to be high-level contact between the ambassador and Washington and the ambassador and whomever, you know, their counterparts is in the country that they're serving. So things can continue as it is right now. Nothing can change. In fact, things could get a little bit worse, particularly as we head towards the elections in Mexico and in the United States. But hopefully, you know, in 2012, there will be a new president in Mexico. Barack Obama may or may not be reelected, but that's going to be a new administration in many ways, regardless. And that's probably going to be the best time to reevaluate what is the status of the relationship.
And also, Carlos Pascual might become the assistant for the Americas in the State Department, and therefore boss of the new ambassador.
Yeah, he could become.
What does this mean to Mexico?
Yeah, he could become the assistant secretary for the Americas in the State Department. Well, it could be very interesting. I mean, knowing Carlos Pascual, I don't think. There could be an advantage, because you will have an assistant secretary that knows and understands Mexico in ways that an assistant secretary normally doesn't. So that could be advantageous for the relationship, because I think Carlos Pascual understands, and I think that was the reason why he resigned, that the relationship between the United States and Mexico is fundamental for the national security of both countries. I mean, both countries have to figure out a way to get along because of mutual interests that they have. Now, the way you solve these problems, each country has a different perspective. So what is interesting of having someone like Carlos Pascual as an assistant secretary is a public official, a diplomat who knows and understands Mexico. So that, interestingly enough, could be very, very helpful, especially if the crisis continues in the relationship.
Well, thank you very much for this conversation, Ana María. It's always a pleasure having you here.
Oh, it's great to talk to you, Gabi. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.